Thank you for coming to our third seminar this week. I will try to summarize a few of the key themes of my work in recent years. I will be repeating briefly some of the things that I've mentioned before in a previous lecture for those of you who have been attending them, and just to give a chance also to new students that came here for the first time to understand better the background. And then for the second hour, right, Michele, we'll have the chance to discuss and take questions. And I'm happy to, yes, I'm happy to discuss any of the issues that I'll be presenting today, but also if you have read something from the articles we have circulated and you have questions from that, I'm also happy to discuss that and to take any questions you might have. Okay, so how do humans become? This is probably the kind of general question that the archaeology of human becoming is trying to answer. The short answer I will propose in this lecture is the following. Humans are creative organisms of a social, semiotic, and prosthetic disposition. My basic thesis is simple. Humans become through their creative engagement with the material world. That is, we evolve by constantly creating new things, which in turn transform our minds, our experience of selfhood, and the ways we relate to one another and make sense of the world. I should clarify that I use the term things in the broadest active sense of materials, forms, and techniques, and not just in the passive sense of finished and well-defined material objects. Humans construct signs, draw lines, and leave memory traces. Importantly, they maintain a transactional relationship with other beings, human and non-human, that surrounds them. This applies to the modern forager of digital information as it applies to the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer and tool maker. There is nothing in our genes, as there is nothing in our cultures that can explain that. Instead, we need to look at the lived space in between, that is, the space where brain, body, and culture conflate. This openness of the human mind to what can be described better as a form of Bergsonian creative evolution rather than that of Darwinian natural selection is one of the distinctive features of our species' ability to evolve. I call that special feature of human becoming metaplasticity. We are plastic creatures inextricably intertwined with the plasticity of forms that we make. This largely neglected creative dimension of human evolution speaks of the unity of growth and making and of the primacy of situated action. It speaks of our ability to influence our developmental paths by changing, mediating, and regulating the flows of energy and matter. It also indicates that the nature of human intelligence is to remain subject to deep reorganization and reconstitution, thus to remain in an important way incomplete. I will return to explore those themes in more details later in my talk. First, I would like to present briefly my theoretical framework. The material engagement theory I advocate blends the archaeological interest in the study of materiality and process with new theories of situated, enacted, extended, and distributed cognition. The aim is to change the way we think about the relation between cognition and material culture, or people and things. The material engagement approach can be described by means of three major working hypotheses, each one targeting a different but complementary aspect of human becoming, namely cognition, signification, and agency. So we have the hypothesis of the extended mind, which basically argues that many processes that we tend to classify as cognitive or mental and prefer to localize inside the head are better described as distributed processes extending beyond the individual into the socio-material environment. The second, an active signification, which essentially proposed that the meaning of things is not the product of symbolic representation, but of an action. Material signs bring forth rather than simply represent preformed concepts. And last, the hypothesis of material agency, which basically states that agency is not a human property, but the emergent product of situated activity. What an entity is in itself does not really matter. What does matter is what it becomes and where it stands inside a community of action and material engagement. Now, if all that sounds too complicated, let me put it more simply using some more familiar examples that can help us to focus and visualize the proposed entanglement of mind and matter. I will use two examples of such entanglements, one in the form of clay and the other in the form of a stick. So the image on top depicts a blind person walking using a cane, and in the image at the bottom, you can see the forming of clay on the potter's wheel. I begin with the first example. Let's think of this blind person with a stick. This example, which I borrow, of course, from the philosopher Merleau-Ponty and the anthropologist Gregory Bateson, nicely brings about the question of boundaries. Not only the unity of the blind person and the stick offers a useful means to conceptualize the continuity between cognition, perception, and action, it also speaks of the profound plasticity of the human mind. Using a stick, the blind person turns touch into sight. Tactility is projected onto the point of contact between the tip of the stick and the outside environment. As a result, the brain treats the stick as an actual part of the body. This is not simply a matter of expanding the neural representation of the so-called peripersonal space, that is, the space immediately surrounding the body. Neither is a matter of delimiting a new range of action possibilities, dependencies, or sensory hierarchies, for example, substituting vision for touch. The stick does more than that. Important to keep in mind is that whatever actual form the stick might have taken in the history of our species, from the earliest Paleolithic stone tools to the latest information technology, its primary function was that of a pathway. Through the stick, the human species, much like the blind person in our example, discovers and makes sense of the environment. It also enacts a way forward. Let's not forget that from an evolutionary point of view, the main reason we have a brain is to move, not to contemplate. To begin with, moving was thinking. And it seems fair to say that the reason we came to have our sophisticated capacities for language and imagination is that we gave our movement purpose, attention, and meaning. We had to use a stick to accomplish that, a material scaffold or anchor to think through and with. If we have a sapient mind, it's because we are Homo faber. Tool making and tool using was just the beginning in a series of prosthetic gestures and material signs. It is especially in the latter sense that the example of the blindsman's stick encapsulates the spirit of material engagement theory. It reminds us of something that we often forget, namely that it is in the nature of human intelligence to remain open to drastic deep reorganization by incorporating new technical mediations. The example of the blind person with a stick helps us to overcome this unproductive split between the mind and the material world that constrain and impose limits on how we think about the process of thinking in archaeology, anthropology, and beyond. I should explain that my aim here is not to abandon boundaries altogether. Rather, the aim is to question the authority of fixed boundaries and to help us rediscover their border-like ontology. Boundaries, as the sociologist Richard Sennett proposes, using an example from natural ecology, are like cell walls. Borders, in contrast, resemble the cell membrane. A boundary, Sennett writes, is simply an edge where things end. A border, by contrast, is a site of exchange and interaction. So the aim of process archaeology and material engagement theory is to turn boundaries into borders. In other words, to shift our attention from the distinction of mind and matter towards a more relational way of thinking about brain, body, and the material world. To that end, the transactional character of the relation between the blind person and the stick provides a diachronic point of reference for the profound embodiment, ecology, and plasticity of the human mind. So what I want to do in the rest of my talk is try to explore the major implications of this ongoing entanglement of people and things, of mind and matter, for the traditional ways we understand the process of creativity and the role that it plays in human becoming. So I now turn to our second image of pottery making. I find in the plasticity of clay a potent analogy for the creative process of human becoming that I want to explore. What I plan to do is simply to follow the flow in between the hand of the potter and the affordances of clay on their way to produce form. I want to use this specific entanglement of flow and form on the fast bodily time scale as my grounding metaphor towards an archaeology of human becoming over the long term. The question I want to ask is this: what it means to say of human beings that they are producers of forms. I want you to notice that what we see here is in this image specifically, is a single moment in the life history of this material object. I mean, if we can call it an object at this stage. If we want, we could look at a different moment from an earlier stage in the process of making. We could look, for instance, at the very beginning, where the act of centering the clay takes place. Or instead, we can look at the final stages of the process, or maybe at the final product itself. However, there is a reason I choose to focus on this specific moment rather than at some other stage in the process of making. There is something about that specific moment that is tying together the totality of the form-making processes brought about in the making of this particular thing. This moment binds together past, present, and future in a way that is less visible at earlier stages of the process and much harder to see when the object is finished. Mainly, this is because it is during that moment that the underlying tension between mind and matter is best revealed. The image itself may be static, depicting a single moment in time, but nothing we see in that image is motionless or timeless. To use Alfred North Whitehead's terminology, we witness a processual event. That is, we see a flow of energies within and between varieties of materials. I choose this event because it embodies the process ontology of flux that I'm trying to articulate. It also exemplifies the unity of mind with matter and shows how energies are being transformed into agencies. Agencies, when embodied in living bodies, can also acquire experiential content and sometimes develop awareness, namely a sense of agency. But this awareness or consciousness of agency, characteristic of human bodies, is largely an illusion. There is no agent apart from the action. As we said, agency is not a permanent property that someone has independently of action, but the emergent product of material engagement, seen in our image as the creative tension between the potter's hand and the clay. Clay, on its way to become an object, exists in between the states of form and flow. It is stable enough to be identified and named as a vase. Still, it remains plastic, open to change and transformation. Partly material, clay, partly artifact, a human-made object with certain shape, texture, color, and possible function, partly mental, a way of thinking and feeling with and through clay. In a way, then, this image speaks of two kinds of uncertainty, one about origins and the other about endings. I say also endings because as long as this object remains plastic, it remains unfinished. I want to emphasize that moment of ongoing plasticity and incompleteness because I want to use it as the grounding metaphor for my perspective on human becoming and the evolution of mind. I will return to that point at the end of my talk. First, I want to dwell a bit further on the transactional and participatory character of form making and to introduce the notions of thinking and creative thinking. I use the notion of thinking to articulate the process of thinking and feeling with, through and about material things. As some of you may know, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his essay, The Thing, uses this term thinking to express how things gather space and time. My own use of the term thinking retains this original sense of gathering, but I also diverge from the Heideggerian phenomenological path, emphasizing instead the agency of things in human thinking, or else what I call the cognitive life of things. In any case, the basic premise that I want to communicate through the notion of thinking is very simple. We humans are thinkers. No other animal has been or can be defined as a species on the basis of its relationship with a variety of things and material forms that it makes. We humans are precisely a species of this rather strange sort. Let me explain. I say we are strange not because I deny that other animals are capable of thinking. We know that they are. Nor do I say we are strange because I believe that by making things and by thinking through things, we overcome the limits of our nature, entering into a separate cultural realm. No other controversy in the study of human becoming has been more unhelpful and misleading than that between nature and culture. There is no moment in human history and human evolution where biology gave way to culture. Human becoming has always been inseparably linked with the developmental contingencies of human action. No bodily activity, not even the basic capacity for bipedal locomotion is immune to the situated dynamics of real life ontogenetic development. As the anthropologist Marcel Mauss neatly pointed out in his famous essay on bodily techniques, there are no natural way to move our bodies. And I suggest it would be equally wrong to think of bodily movement as the product of culture. There is no natural or cultural way to move our bodies. Instead, we should think of the acting body as a relational, developmental achievement of situated engagement. And this is the true story of human evolution. For instance, the body of the potter in our example, entering this craft of pottery making, working with clay and developing the skills of the job, becomes more than just a body. It becomes situated. What that means is that the body becomes specific and different. It embodies a unique developmental life history. It becomes affected by the physical and psychoactive properties of clay, by the patterns and the rhythms of coordination, and by the kinesthetic experiences, the muscular tacit memories and skills attached to it. Unlike other bodies with no special connection to the art of potting and the material of clay, the potter's body will come to know, with practice and effort, of course, how to touch and feel the clay. The potter's body must be reliably and in different conditions able to identify what kind of actions clay invites or allows, and be able to relate to the properties of this material in a way that other human bodies cannot. This is a dynamical process that involves a temporal alliance of specific skills, materials, gestures, and sequences of action. Now, the usual mistake is to see the material elements of practice, for instance, the wheel or the clay or the tools that the potters are using, as passive, external influences operating from the outside and through and on the potter's body. By contrast, the view of situated and process-oriented perspective that comes with material engagement theory is grounded on the assumption that this relevant material environment becomes incorporated into the body schema, actively operating inside and through the body. So not from the outside, but from the inside. As I will explain below, I do not mean that in the discontinuous representational sense, but in the rather continuous and active sense. It is not the world that is represented on the inside, rather it is the human body that is extended on the outside, seeking sources of agency and new paths of realization and self-specification. This last point brings us right at the heart of the phenomenon that I'm trying to capture when I talk about human strangeness. We humans have made thinking in general and creative thinking in particular part of our nature. Put it simply, with thinking, biological heredity becomes creative evolution. Instead of simply reproducing ourselves, we rather extend ourselves and we construct new cognitive and material ecologies for growing and transforming our minds. We create things which in turn create us. Humans have developed the morphogenetic habit of building and then using what they have built for changing, willingly or unwillingly, what the world affords and how the world is revealed. We bring things to life and into human consciousness, and we use them to reshape our bodies, reconfigure our minds, and reinvent ourselves. That is, we are creative thinkers. I use the term creative thinking to designate the human disposition to the discovery of new varieties of material forms and modes of an active signification through a saturated, attentive engagement with things and for generating materials. This working definition also implies that creative thinking is not some kind of pre-given and static adaptation, but is instead continuously generated and transformed in the constructive dialogue between maker and material. The feature that particularly marks creative thinking is the combination of an active discovery and making. Humans usually discover or create. Creative thinking denotes the process by which we create in order to discover. That is, the process where we make things and that those things provide the material ecology for invention by changing the landscape of affordances, making visible what was previously invisible. Obviously, creative thinking inherits from material engagement theory the commitment to a view of thinking as profoundly embodied and distributed, spanning the boundaries of the individual brain and body. This basic epistemic commitment has important implications for cognitive archaeology, since creativity is no longer seen as a special feature of few exceptional individuals, but as something far more ordinary, lying at the heart of human becoming. Human evolution is creative evolution. Pottery making makes for an interesting case of creative thinking because, as I learned from studying with many practitioners of this craft, it demands a great deal of form-generating skills, but no obsession with novelty. What all potters seem to embody is a passion for craft, a creative affection, or what I call the feeling of and for clay. This feeling of and for clay can be seen as a manifestation of material agency. The potter develops in time the awareness that he or she works with a peculiar form of vibrant matter. I borrowed the term from Jane Bennett. There is nothing mystical about the emergent sensitivity of the potter to the energies of the material at hand. The feeling of clay develops naturally as a function of bodily fine-tuning, attentive engagement, and unskillment. Descriptions of clay as a warm and living material are common among potters, and they seem to provide a precise and intuitive account of the cognitive ecology involved. There is nothing natural or unnatural, objective or subjective about the use of this kind of animate language. The metaphor of life is employed explicitly or implicitly as an effective means for the abduction of agency through rigorous phenomenological description. Importantly, these phenomenological descriptions refer to real experiential qualities and habits hard to measure and express otherwise. In that sense, the perceived agentive and animate quality of clay, far from being the product of confabulation or illusion, is more simply the dynamical product of the participatory interaction between the potter and clay that may well be described as a variety of participatory sense-making. I should explain that the notion of participatory sense-making originates in recent approaches to social cognition from an enactive perspective. It has been defined by the psychiatrist Thomas Fuchs and the philosopher Hanne Juger, as in a quote, a mutual incorporation, namely a process in which the lived bodies of both participants extend and form a common intercorporality. Now, at first sight, it may seem that such a notion of mutual incorporation is inapplicable in the context of pottery making, where this kind of intersubjectivity is lacking due to the often solitary character of the creative task. And yet, this is exactly the kind of mutual engagement that we observe in the case of creative thinking, albeit not between two humans, but in between humans and things. as is the case with social encounters, where human participants unconsciously coordinate their movements and postures to facilitate their sense-making, the potter's gesture in our example are coupled and resonate, the potter with the affordances of clay, as if maker and material, potter and clay, participate in each other's becoming. Creativity can then be seen as a relational achievement that emerges out of an effort to create and align people and things. What I call the feeling of and for clay refers precisely to this dynamical process of creative material engagement, wherein material and human agency are coupled to each other through the harmonious negotiations between the potter's body and the material. I want to return now to the question I raised at the beginning of my talk. What does it mean to say of human beings that they are creators of form? For instance, the form of a vase out of clay. A good way to bring this into clearer focus is by examining the authorship and causality of the doing. That is, by asking who or what is the source or agent of creativity. According to the standard cognitivist model of mental causation, the answer is simple: the potter did it. In particular, the potter's internal mental states directed the body to move in a certain way or ways to accomplish a creative action. Whatever creativity is, it seems that, at least on the standard account of action and mental causation, it flows from the brain through bodily movement to the world. But this model can be objected on several grounds. For instance, one major problem with creative agency in the context of mediated action is that the purity of action and causality is lost. Entangled with the throwing and shaping of clay, the potter's creative agency cannot be rigidly defined and delimited. As every potter is well aware, creativity consists not in propositions, beliefs, plans, or prior intentions and representations about the clay, but instead in the confident, skillful, and attentive engagement with it. Materials and techniques educate and guide our senses. They move and constrain our bodies. This also means that the constituents of the creative process are not to be found before or outside the throwing or shaping of the pot. Creativity is in the throwing, in the shaping. It is also important to recognize that different components of the creative process may well interact in different timescales. This means that the different components of creativity may act together in ways that can be, but are not always, in synchrony. The creative process is multi-temporal. It comprises of living moments that differ in duration, intensity, or location, but it nonetheless remains a material process that is open to empirical investigation. As we discussed, a common fallacy has been to think of the process of creation as the transcription or translation of a pre-existing form or plan realized in some ideal mental domain to the physical world of material engagements. With creative thinking, we no longer need to be bound by this representational logic and the internalist view of mind that it implies. Taking this view of creativity seriously in the study of human becoming leads to a conception of developmental plasticity based on the process of lifelong fabrication and creative evolution. That is, based on a mode of becoming where the world, mind, and matter is always partially constructed and thus incomplete. I will end my talk with some final thoughts on human plasticity and incompleteness. We are used to think of our sapient minds with all our unique capacities as the apex of human evolution. It follows from my previous arguments that this vision of modern human cognition as complete and fixed, adapted to past environments that no longer exist, is rather unhelpful, if not entirely wrong. In any case, my approach to human evolution instead sees the human mind as an unfinished project, potentially in a permanent state of ongoing evolution. I said before that we humans are different from other animals in that we have made thinking our nature. I should also insist that we humans are also a species incomplete by nature. Notice here that the logic of the classical anthropological question on the unity and diversity of the human mind is reversed. There is no underlying biological stability that ensures the comparability of human variation. Rather, it is through its openness to cultural influence and variation that a comparable species identity can be formed. Notice also that throughout this lecture, I have been speaking of human becoming instead of becoming human, which is the term traditionally used in the archaeology of human origins. This small terminological shift has important consequences. In particular, becoming human implies a view of humanity as a fixed evolutionary state. It refers to the process of human origins, that is, to the process of speciation by which we came to be the kind of species we are between 100,000 years and 200,000 years ago. On that view, humanity is a biological given upon which we build layers and varieties of culture. The underlying assumption here is that once that stage have achieved, all humans are naturally equipped, born with a set of potential capacities which may become realized with some variation in different cultural settings. This human potential is genetically fixed and pre-given, what we call innate, and nothing that an organism does or experiences in its life is capable of changing it. Now, human becoming instead means something different. It refers to an open and largely ongoing process. Humanity is not a genetic setup or an evolutionary stage, but a dynamic coevolutionary entanglement of people, materials, and things. Human becoming is never finished. It is always ongoing. Similarly, there is no moment in the history of human evolution where biology gave way to culture, as there is no essential human nature engineered by natural selection in the distant past. Culture, in this case, is not a separate added layer of complexity, an envelope, if you want, or an external social skin, but instead a compound of material and developmental forces that mingle, allowing us to become what we are. To explain more simply the distinction between becoming human and human becoming, we can use the example of pottery. A revealing analogy can be drawn here between the process of humanization and the formation of the vase out of clay. Most people's view of human origins would be akin to the moment when the vase comes out of the oven. The firing of pottery is analogous to the irreversible evolutionary changes brought about in the past during the speciation phase. As with the heat hardening the clay, making it impossible to return to its previous plastic state, so with evolution, the human form is now given and fixed. It can no longer change. There are, nonetheless, the fallacy continues, all sorts of things we can do on the surface, producing endless variation. It is the latter phase that most people will identify with cultural evolution and societal change. The core identity of the vase is fixed, but you are flexible to play with surface decoration. Now, in contrast to this linear view of becoming human beings as the heritable aggregate of a fixed, evolved biological core and a variable cultural surface, in my view, human becoming is better expressed with this image. That is the image of the still plastic and incomplete vast at the pre-fired stage, not entirely formal, but still open to change. Humans are a species incomplete by nature. The extraordinary plasticity of human mind and its reciprocal openness to creative evolution becomes a distinctive feature of our species. Obviously, I'm not just talking about brain or neuroplasticity here. I take we all agree that the brain of humans and other animals is intrinsically plastic. It changes both structurally and functionally in response to the environment and experience. What I'm proposing, and thus my use of the term creative evolution, which I borrow from the famous book of Henry Louis Bergson, is that we humans, unlike other species, seem to have more than just a plastic mind. We have a mind which is also inextricably intertwined with the plastic culture of the force we make. I'm trying to gesture towards a different kind of plasticity, the plasticity of a mind not limited by the skin. This is what I called at the beginning metaplasticity. The focus here is on understanding the nature of plastic changes, not at the level of the individual, but in the broader ecology of mind. That is where brain, body, and culture conflate. Human beings, understood as real living creatures that move and act in this world, are the developmental products of this conflation. If you separate the three, if you separate brain, body, and culture, you end up with a number of overly simplified abstractions about lifeless categories. I'm not denying the analytical value of those abstractions for many disciplines, but I do think they are misleading when it comes to understanding human becoming. A precondition for that is the recognition that from the perspective of material engagement, mind has no exact and pre-specified location. Cognition is not a within property, it is an in-between process. So for process archaeology, thinking is thinking. And I will end with this statement. Thank you very much.